let's talk about imports and exports. So first off, we've got to talk about the fact that there are a couple of different import-export syntaxes out there that are really common right now. There's the ES syntax or Es6 syntax or ECMAScript 6 or also ECMAScript 2015, whatever you want to say. So there's the import-export syntax for ES6, and there's also the common JS import-export syntax. So let's take a quick look at both of those, and we're going to start with exports. Let's pretend we have a file, export.js, right? We have our common JS syntax, which is module.exports equals whatever we're exporting. This could be an object, this could be a function, this could be a string. Right here, we're just using a string to make it nice and easy to demonstrate. What we're doing here is saying whenever this file gets imported somewhere or required somewhere, what we want that requirement to resolve to is whatever module.exports is equivalent to. So we're going to get into some more advanced exports here in just a minute, but for now we're just going to export that string. The ES6 equivalent of that is setting a variable. Here I'm using const, but you could use let or var or whatever you wanted to. We're just going to leave it with const for now. We're saying const foo equals string of foo, right? And now we're going to do export default foo. This is a little more verbose, but I'm going to show you what it resolves to, and when we get into the more complicated syntax, you'll see why it's pretty cool. So now let's pretend we have an import.js file. What we do here is we are literally importing the export.js file, right? So we're going to say require export.js. This is the common JS syntax for this. And then whatever this require resolves to, we're going to assign that value to the foo variable. So we already know that it's going to resolve to the string of foo, right? So if we were to do this in the real world and we were to log out, like, or what is the value of foo? It would be equivalent to the string of foo. The difference here between that and ES6 syntax is, first off, we don't need the .js part as part of the ES6 import-export spec, is that is not necessary. So we're going to import foo from export. Now foo here could be literally anything. Just like up here, it could be literally anything. So we could change this to blep and change this to giggity, and these would still resolve to the same thing, because what they're getting is whatever the file resolves to. So if I do module.exports equals the string of foo, then blep now is going to equal a string of foo. Or if I do export default foo, I don't have to change anything up here. If I say import giggity from export, then giggity will be equivalent to the string of foo. Okay, let's get into some more advanced syntax. What we've got now is in our common JS syntax, we've actually got two different syntaxes here. So module.exports is an object by default. The way that things are set on it is kind of fancy. Node does, oh, I completely forgot to mention, the reason common JS is so popular is because this is what you do in Node. You can use import-export syntax in Node, but you have to run it through Babel. Node does not natively support import-export syntax, and they're not going to anytime soon. So the common JS syntax is what you're going to deal with if you're in Node.js. Now, again, exports get some fancy things, so it starts off as an object. We can also assign an object to it, and it'll handle it in some fancy ways whenever it gets imported. We're not going to get too deep into that right now. Let's just say we're going to set exports to an object. We'll set the value of exports.foo to the string of foo, and the value of exports.bar to the string of bar. Or we could do it this way because, again, exports is inherently an object, so we can just set the property foo and the property bar this way. Alternatively, the Es6 syntax is going to be export and then whatever our assignment is. Now, if we go back and look at the first tutorial, we're doing export default of our const foo equals foo. Whereas here, we're just doing export const foo equals foo. This is going to matter when we get into the imports. So if we come down here and we look at our common JS syntax and relate that, we're just going to get rid of this first syntax so it's a little easier to read and add some space in here. There we go. Magical. Okay. So in our common JS syntax, we can do this right here. If you're not familiar with this, it is a destructuring assignment. What we're saying is when we require this, we know it's going to come back as an object. So take the properties of that object of foo and bar, so export.js, whatever it resolves to, which is going to be this object, take the property foo and the property bar and assign them to the constants of foo and bar. So if we look at the output of that, foo will equal the string of foo and bar will equal the string of bar, which is pretty much what we expect. Now down here is a simpler version where we're just importing the whole thing. We're setting it all to a single variable, which means that, again, it's going to import as an object. So the property of foo and the property of bar will equal the strings of foo and bar respectively on the object baz. The Es6 syntax is pretty similar. We're going to import foo and bar with a destructuring assignment, and it's going to do literally the exact same thing. Now here's where things get a little different in this slightly more advanced syntax, is that if I do import star as baz from export, now what this is doing is basically the same thing that the second line of the common JS import is doing, which means import everything from this exports file as baz. So bring it all in and assign it to an object called baz. This, once again, can be literally anything. It's completely arbitrary, so it could be giggity, or it could be blep, or it could be whatever we want it to be. We're going to leave it as baz, but then again, just as it is in the second form of the common JS syntax, baz.foo is the string of foo, baz.bar is the string of bar. Something to note here is that, actually, we're going to move on to the next syntax, and then I'll show you what I was about to talk about there. So part 3, we are just looking at Es6 syntax here. We don't need common JS because common JS doesn't do all of these features. So we've already covered some of them and how you do them in common JS. We're going to get into the Es6 specific stuff. So we're kind of combining our first two pieces of this tutorial, right? We've got our part 2 where we're exporting a couple of constants, and then we've got part 1 where we're exporting a default constant. If we import foo and bar and we basically destructure export, we will get the same feedback that we expect, except baz is going to be undefined. Now that probably makes sense if you're familiar with destructuring arguments, because we're not saying get baz. However, if we do say get baz, it's still going to return undefined. Now that sounds weird because we're exporting baz, right? Except that we're not. The way that default exports work is it's actually going to pile this down so that all it's exporting is this string of baz as the default. So if we do import foo bar baz, we get foo, we get bar, we don't get baz. We could also do this with an export const baz, and that would change it so that we do in fact get our string back. But typically you're not going to see an export default with a bunch of things. What you might see is something like this, where they do foo bar baz, because that way it will, again, destructure out into the object, and you get an object that just returns all of these things. You don't see that a whole lot because you can do that second syntax that I showed you in the last part of the tutorial, which is import star as baz. Now this is going to do something extra interesting. We're actually going to get this value back, but we get it back as the default property. It's not baz like you might expect. That's because we're exporting default. It's also because of the way that common JS syntax gets compiled down, is export default gets set to basically module.exports.default. And then whenever you do an import, it'll look for that default. If it finds it, that's what it'll bring in. We also have our import baz, which I've got it set saying that it will bring that in, but it actually won't. If we try to import baz, like I mentioned up here, we just get undefined. Oh no, I'm sorry, I've got that totally backwards. This is actually the default import. So if we import baz from export, then the value of Baz is going to equal Baz. Now this is back to being arbitrary, so we could call this giggity or blep or whatever we want, and it's going to equal Baz, because what we're doing is assigning the default export. Since we don't have star as or a destructuring assignment, it's just going to look for the default export, and in this case it's blep. Now there's one other thing here that I didn't put together a part for, so we'll just throw this together real quick, and I'll show you another feature of imports that you may find useful. I've used it for a few things before, and that is just importing without an assignment. So if we say import, basically what this is going to do is we could do something like a closure with function console.log heyo or hello world, because boring. And then this is an IIFE, so it's going to immediately execute. So whenever we import this, it's just going to fire off that function. We could also just do the console log now that I'm looking at it, but I've done this for a lot of things, like 3JS for a long time didn't have a namespaced import, so you had to import it, but it would be global. So that's a bad thing if you're not familiar with programming paradigms. Having a global export is a bad thing. So I had a special little shim that would import 3JS, re-export it, and then delete the window variable. Of course, that caused all kinds of chaos whenever I tried to use 3JS later down the road, but the point is, you can do all kinds of cool things like this. One really, really neat example I can show real quick is one of my shims here for string.capitalize. The way that I use this is I have just this file that just does that. It sets these methods on the prototype. And then when I import them, I actually can't, I think it's in the Bootstrap, yeah. I just do a bunch of imports that just import the file. So they immediately execute and then they're done. And so those are acting on the global scope. They're doing, dirty things that you really shouldn't do, but sometimes it's useful. So anyways, that is my tutorial on import exports. Hopefully you found it useful. Make sure to like, comment, subscribe. Definitely comment if you have any questions, or if you're like, oh no, Trezzy, that was dumb. You shouldn't do it that way. And let me know. Thanks for watching.